Hello, my name is Sharon Tomlin, and I'd like to welcome you to the session on how to research female ancestors of the Caribbean. Nowadays, despite more information being available to the community to research our female ancestors of the Caribbean, there is still largely a lack of presence in both present and historical records. This can pose a challenge when undertaking research to better understand the rigors and the nuances of the African Caribbean women in history. But before I start, I'd like to draw your attention to the disclaimer. My apologies. The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong solely to the creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of FamilySearch International and RootsTech. So let's begin. Today we will cover Introduction to African Caribbean Women, Resilience and Rebellion with an overview of the cases of Nanny Griggs of Barbados and Nanny of the Maroons of Jamaica, understanding and interpreting records of local cultural practices and occupations, recorded presence in pre and civil registration records, and finally, an overview of some online resources. But before we begin in earnest, here are some of the challenges that one needs to consider when tracing female line. There tend to be fewer records available, and in many instances, women held no property of their own after marriage. And very rarely do they write wills unless there's something they're able to bequeath. When it comes to identifying our female ancestors, in our community, in the African Caribbean community, there is what you call common law relationships. It's a high, proportion of that. So for the birth event, it's usually registered in the last name of the mother if they're not in a wedded union. Usually in records, the occupation is listed under the name of the mother. For example, she may be a laborer, milliner, or seamstress, and it will be written in the recorded. And this is usually common practice in the Jamaica birth civil registration records and others. The marriage index shows first and last name and any additional names of both parties. And usually, when you find a female present at many of the birthing events, recorded as a witness or an informant, it may indicate that she is what you call a informal folk midwife. I will talk a bit more about that later on. So, having had a chance to look at these lovely images, it reminded me of many years ago when I had the privilege of meeting my paternal grandmother and great grandmother after having migrated from England to Jamaica for the first time. I was inspired by a thick textbook that was placed on my grandmother's bureau. I had just turned 11 years old and inquisitive. My grandmother carefully explained that her mother was a midwife, and that was one of the last books to survive from the collection. It piqued my interest as at the time I had not met women with such history of being trained in both traditional folk midwifery as well as in the latest methods in midwifery. My father confirmed this with even more interesting anecdotes on the variety of modes of transports seeking the services of my great grandmother. He described people arriving by foot, donkey, and motor vehicles. However, my great grandmother was like many women whose early experiences were not addressed. So these images represent women and females and young girls from two eras. The first image on your left and my left represents two adolescent girls, one of whom is having her hair dressed, or we call it combed. Those of us with such hair type can understand the significance of the hair grooming process, being one where the occasion where we had to sit patiently and not rebel against sometimes the harsh handling of the hair. This picture was taken around 1898. The second image depicts women who were gathering their wares to sell during the period of trans. This happened during the period, particularly during the period of transatlantic enslavement. Enslaved women took up a high proportion of the domestic duties and roles alongside men. Rest days were far and few between, in that there were set days dictated by the enslaver for enslaved people to grow food provisions for themselves and their family. Author and academic Blanca Silvestrini observed that the experiences of Caribbean women were still outside the realms of history. Matters are made worse in that many women did not have access to written records. So, therefore, their experiences, or the written word rather, their experiences were portrayed less in print. So, I'm afraid this is one of the challenges when searching for our female ancestor. So, in terms of, we'll talk about resistance and resilience, and we'll refer to the case of Nanny of the Maroons, Jamaica, and Nanny Griggs of Barbados. There are examples of female resistance and resilience during the period of transatlantic enslavement. Resistance took a variety of forms that included resistance, and it was demonstrated through quiet contemplation. Subtle, they were subtle, often passed unnoticed. And then there are other forms, such as marronage, which is a direct form of resistance to enslavement and usually consists of unauthorized leave from servile duties. There are two types of marronage: petit marronage, which was temporary and kind of seldom included violence and destruction, and grand marronage, which usually involves a permanent desertion from the plantation and unfortunately usually accompanied by violence, which usually means that the person lives freely mid slavery. Um, I'd also now like to draw your attention to the cases of Nanny of the Maroons and Nanny Griggs. So, Nanny of the Maroons, not much is known in terms of where she was born, but she became a military leader, a female chieftain as described, a strategist. She was a key and keen supporter of women and children in the community. She was skilled in guerrilla warfare, where she strategically led in picking off the more technically savvy British militia. The same for Nanny Griggs of Barbados. Not much is not known of her, but she was considered a literate slave and who had extensive knowledge of Barbados. She was recorded as being of a highly valued slave, very high cost, £130 in a day. As to the reason why she was valued so highly, it is not yet clear. However, she was a literate slave, and she was privy to a lot of information, and how that happened again is unknown. In 1816, Nanny Griggs came to light as a result of her connection to Busa, who, along with others, planned the uprising with people from different estates in Barbados in response to the constant brutal treatment of, of the enslaved people. So we're going to look at some local cultural practices common in the Caribbean, starting with pregnancy. During the period of enslavement, it was noted that on plantations there were notable decrease in women carrying pregnancies to full term. Now, enslaved women were treated as work units as well as breeding units. It was one means that the enslaved women considered how to build power for themselves, and one way was to control when to have children. So, one of the means in which they did so is to employ practices such as provision. They were providing herbal treatments particularly those that were called abortifacients that induced abortion. Other methods included the mother would lactate for a long period of time in order to space out having children. So, in terms of birthing events, traditional folk midwives who were known as Nana in Jamaica. A Nana is expected to already have had a child in order to practice as a main prerequisite. Nanas were considered very important and of high standing in the community. They were usually active members in their local communities. Incidentally, my great grandmother was always called a Nana and addressed as such. Remedies? Well, herbal remedies in particular, such as thyme and spice teas, were used for uterine inertia, and the application of castor oil and olive oil were used to control and support contractions, manage contractions. So now we will be looking at registered records to provide a brief biography on each woman. We will start with Una Marson. Una Marson was born in 1905 in the parish of St. Elizabeth, Jamaica. She was appointed assistant editor of the Jamaican political journal called Jamaica Critic, and in 1928 she became Jamaica's first female editor, publisher of her own magazine, The Cosmopolitan. Belonged to the International Alliance of Women, which is a global feminist organization, and she worked at the BBC during the 1940s. And one of her noted roles was helping the members of the Army and the Royal Navy to deliver messages to their loved ones from wherever they were serving in the UK back home to the Caribbean via the radio. Now, if you notice, this is a typical birth certificate and a Jamaican birth certificate. And this is, I'm referring to the long strip at the bottom of the screen. And you'll see about in column, the sixth column, where it states the rank or profession of the father. She was the daughter of a Baptist minister, and that set her in ready mode to um, achieve as much as she has done. She was maybe at a slight better advantage than others in the island at the time. And as you can see from the top right hand corner of the screen is a blue plaque dedicated to her work, the fact that she's a campaigner. She was also connected to the work of with Save the Children. Another person here, Louise Bennett Coverley, renowned poet. She's an artist. She was a broadcaster. She was one of the first ones to accept the Jamaican dialect and help to create that acceptance of the dialect. In 1945, she won a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London. And from the 1970s, sorry, my apologies, the 1970s, she hosted the program Ring Ding. And this was broadcast on TV in Jamaica. And by the way, my sister Marion appeared on the show. You'll notice that the strip of the certificate, it's her actual birth certificate. She was born 1919 in Kingston. And as we discussed earlier, you notice that the space where it's, the name of and surname of the father is blank. That's because they were in what is called an unwed union. So therefore, he wouldn't be recorded on that certificate. Sometimes, for the in the Jamaican context, in terms of their civil registration records, you may see the word occupier, and that usually indicates that's the father of the child, especially if they're in an unwed union. This is an example of an Anguillan from a birth index entry for Olive Hodge 1901. You'll notice the green arrow where the parents' name, last name was Hodge, and the name of the child, the first name is Olive, and she was born in Anguilla. And the final columns A and B, A would indicate the volume in which the birth registered information can be located, and column B is the page number. You notice in terms of the parent's last name, uh, which begins with letter H, in the first column, it's not listed alphabetically or chronologically, alphabetically. It is listed, and this is typical of most of the Caribbean records. The events would be recorded at the time the first person who has chosen to register the event, and that's the order in which these names were collated and recorded. So this is the birth register as opposed to birth certificate for Olive Hodge, and you'll notice in the third row, the first column is a number of the certificate itself, the registered entry, but she is identified in the third, her name, the third column, the fact that she's a female, and in her case, both her mother and father were married couple, as the father's name is registered as well as the mother's. Her maiden name, Rogers, and the occupation of the father in about the eighth column, registered and recorded as a labourer. And the witness to the event or the informant was an Anne Elizabeth Hodge. Um, and that's the place where they lived in Grand Quarter. So we're going to have a quick look at the pre-civil registration records. So in terms of the pre-civil registration, before we start on the slave records, tend to be records that are church records, primarily in the Caribbean, dissenter records as well as non-dissenter records. And that would include churches that are dissenter churches, such as the Moravians, the Baptists, Methodists, Quaker, etc., and non-dissenter records were the Church of England or Anglican records. In terms of the pre-slave records, things that need to be considered when researching the slave records, that a lot of the names of the slaves were held in private collections. Uh, the slave returns are now available for free on Ancestry, and it's a free subscription to that, so you can do some research. These slave returns are triannual slave returns, and the records commenced around 1817. Some slave baptisms recorded per parish, per country, and the names of the slaves were recorded in wills. So if you're fortunate enough to locate a will with some information on your ancestor, that would be a good place to start outside of the other statutory records that are available. Not to forget about the manumitted slaves records in parliamentary records. They're available and accessible online. And not to forget as well that the common law unions, many instances, the sole parent was listed, and enslaved female were rarely listed in the indexes. Really. So in terms of their occupation, we're looking at this lovely image of Amy Bailey. Now, Amy Bailey was born around about 1895, and she represented She was a teacher. She uh, was quite an impressive woman. Um, she belonged to the Jamaica Union of Teachers. She helped to facilitate that in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. She played a major role in reformation of education and particularly drew the attention to that of an inclusive approach when it comes to females from primary school right through to college and university level. And the reason why the this image is here, it depicts a typical example of the wide variety of occupations women entered into. And there are records that exist that will show and highlight the various occupations some of the women were engaged in and employed in. In this instance, these five women represent workers carrying fiber fuel for the consumption in mills, and this was taken in Barbados. So examples of early occupations include doctresses, sick nurses, housekeeper, field hands, laborers, and indentured laborers. And a lot of the domestic tasks were, were were taken place and carried out in the home of the enslavers, usually housekeeping. That would be the preserve of 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 females that were lighter color in complexion, lighter skinned in complexion, and also that of doctresses and sick nurses. Um, but what the community did at the time was found that the Europeans weren't able to manage the various conditions and health conditions, so they reverted to having to work with people of African ancestry, the women of African ancestry, because they carry their practices on how to treat certain conditions, which the European whites weren't familiar with. Other occupations um, that women were engaged in. We've met people such as Una Marson, who was a broadcaster. You've got school mistresses and postmistresses, medicine. On your right, you'll notice an image, and this is an image of Dr. Ada, who was treating a young baby, as you can see in that picture. And there's a nurse supporting family clinic. You have milliners, washerwomen, higgler, and hawker. Higglers and hawker are one in the same. Hawkers and higglers are women that sell in the marketplace. Um, and when I did my research on my family history, I located an ancestor, Frances Tomlin, who was a schoolmistress in 1880s. So it opened our eyes to how varied the various occupations women were engaged in, as well as teachers and music. So here are some examples of online resources. The reason why this image has come up, it's an illustration of how useful the newspapers can be. Now this was sourced from online, and there's a cost attached to it to subscribe to it. It's called newspaperarchives.com. Um, and in it, there are a raft of newspapers digitized for Jamaica in particular from 1834 to present day. And there are a raft of other countries, including Bahamas now, not many from the Caribbean countries that's archived on this particular website, but it's quite useful. Um, in terms of Chinese community in Jamaica, mass migration started around about 1845. Um, although it did commence around about 1808. But Miss Doris Chin Loy represents um, descendants that would have arrived in the island at some stage, and an example um, of her marriage, and which is typical of many of people that were living in Jamaican society, would be announced in the newspaper, and there would be, announcements. Again, this is an example of a newspaper extract from the newspaper, by the way, in the previous slide, as well as this one, it's from the Jamaica Daily Gleaner. And this is an example of a bold headline speaking about Una working at the BBC. This is a difficult picture for me because this is a plantation that my ancestors had were living in the parish of Manchester, Jamaica. And the reason for this image, there are plantation records available, either through securing it through accessing it through ancestry.com, which is another online uh, website, and that's a popular one. Um, in addition to that, the National Archives of the country of interest is likely to hold plantation records. Um, these can be difficult, and there are certain terminologies that are used in these records. And one thing we need to make clear is that people are described in language that is not acceptable and used today. So just to pre-warn people when they do research, people are identified in can, are usually identified in the most using the most abhorrent terms that we don't use today. Just to draw your attention to some suggested online sources: National Library of Jamaica, FamilySearch, done a great job digitizing records throughout of from many countries in the world. The National Archives UK, a project called Caribbean Through a Lens. This is where some of those images were secured from that you've seen in this presentation today. Found a wonderful blog site called Barbados Family History, and a very long established genealogy of Jamaica as uh, coordinated by Madeline Mitchell, and another really useful website called Caribbean Atlas, main universities in the Caribbean, that has created this particular website, another useful source. And there are others. So I'd like to say thank you so much for listening and wish you happy research. Thank you and good luck.